The galaxy was a chaotic, sprawling place where 4,000 different species had figured out how to travel between the stars. They raised empires and waged wars. They bartered and bickered, conquered and made peace, only to shatter it all over again. The one thing holding it all together was the Galactic Concord, a massive assembly where every species had a say, but the loudest ones always got their way. Humanity had been a member of this cosmic family for 300 years, and in all that time, they'd hardly made a peep. When the first human ship blinked into existence at the edge of known space, the whole galaxy turned to look. They always did when a new kid showed up on the block. The scientists scrambled to study them, and the diplomats rushed to shake their hands. And the military leaders, of course, rushed to size them up. What they discovered was fascinating. Humans hailed from a planet they called Earth, a world the Galactic Biological Index had slapped with a Category 7 Death World classification. And that was putting it mildly. Earth was a planet of pure violence. Its very surface buckled and tore itself apart with tectonic fury. The weather could flip from scorching deserts to flash-freezing blizzards in a matter of hours. The radiation from its own star was relentlessly brutal. Its oceans churned with monsters that could swallow a starship whole, and its continents crawled with predators armed with claws, fangs, and venom. And the diseases, they evolved faster there than anywhere else in the known universe. Even the plant life was out to get you. One xenobiologist, after combing through the initial data, had written just one sentence in his report: "How is anything on this world still alive?" But humans were more than just alive. They hadn't just survived their planetary nightmare. They had conquered it. They'd mastered fire, split the atom, decoded their own genes, and even built machines that could think. They clawed their way out of their heavy gravity, touched their moon, hopped to their neighboring planets, and then, finally, they reached for the stars. They arrived on the galactic scene with a quiet self-assurance that some found endearing and others found deeply unsettling. Everyone expected something big from them, whether it was wonderful or terrifying. A species from a death world usually only goes one of two ways. They either become galactic conquerors, using their tough bodies and aggressive survival instincts to forge massive empires, or they burn out, turning all that violence inward until they tear themselves apart. The galaxy held its breath, waiting to see which path humanity would choose. But humanity chose a third option. They did absolutely nothing. They laid claim to 12 star systems out on the galactic rim, a small patch of real estate far from the centers of power. It bordered a spooky region called the Dead Expanse, where old, forgotten civilizations went to die. Frankly, nobody else wanted those systems. The hyperspace lanes were a tangled mess. The planets would need a ton of work to be livable, and the neighborhood was, to be polite, a fixer-upper. The other species just shrugged and let the humans have their little corner. And then the humans just settled in. They built their homes, set up their trade routes, and sent polite diplomats to the conquered who smiled, nodded, voted on minor issues, and never, ever made a fuss. They were fair traders. They kept their promises. By every measure, they were perfectly pleasant neighbors. And that was it. Decades rolled by, then a century, then 2, and then 300 years. In all that time, humanity never expanded beyond their original 12 systems. They never built a massive war fleet. They never joined any military pacts. They never so much as threatened anyone. They didn't even raise their voices in the conquered chambers. When conflicts flared up near their borders, they just quietly rerouted their ships and stayed out of the way. When mighty empires tried to muscle them into alliances, they politely refused. When arms dealers showed them the shiniest new military hardware, they just smiled and said they weren't in the market. Over time, the galaxy just sort of stopped paying attention to them. It wasn't an overnight thing. It was slow, like how you eventually stop noticing a quiet neighbor who keeps to themselves. Other, louder things were happening. The Kregamani Empire imploded into a civil war. A data-based species called the Morathani discovered a new way to communicate faster than light. The Salari Confederation got into a nasty border war with the Jorvan Republic. These were huge, dramatic events that dominated the news and kept the conquered busy. Meanwhile, humanity just stayed put in their 12 systems, minding their own business. The general opinion of them solidified into a simple consensus. Humans were a minor species. Sure, their biology was impressive. Coming from a death world made them ridiculously tough. They were physically stronger and more resilient than most, with insane endurance and an immune system that could shrug off almost anything. Their senses were sharp, their reflexes were fast, and their ability to endure pain was almost comical. But what good was all that horsepower if you never put the pedal to the metal? The word that came up most often when people talked about humanity was disappointing. Here was a species forged in the crucible of one of the galaxy's most brutal worlds. And they'd turned out to be nothing more than quiet traders and agreeable diplomats. The consensus was that their death world hadn't hardened them. It had broken them. It had beaten the fight right out of them, leaving them so exhausted by the struggle to survive that they had no ambition left. Some were even meaner about it. They called humans cowards, weaklings hiding out on the edge of space, too scared to play in the big leagues. Jokes about them were popular in the halls of power. How many humans does it take to win a war? The punchline? Nobody knows. They've never been in one. This sort of humor was a big hit with the more aggressive species, the ones who measured their worth by the number of planets they'd conquered. Nobody ever stopped to wonder why a species from a death world might choose to be quiet. Nobody bothered to ask what they'd been up to in their little corner of the galaxy for 300 years. Nobody ever thought to question why a species that survived a planet like Earth would be afraid of anything. Well, almost nobody. Ambassador Rael Saurin of the Bethari Dominion was definitely not one of the few. He was the exact type of person who had already made up his mind and saw no point in cluttering it with new information. The Bethari were a proud, ancient race, tall and imposing, looking like a cross between a bird of prey and a reptile. Their scales shimmered like oil on water, their ancestral wings had evolved into powerful arms, and their golden eyes could see light in spectrums others couldn't even imagine. Their empire was 6,000 years old, and they'd spent most of that time doing what they did best, conquering things. The Bethari Dominion held 900 star systems in its iron grip. Their fleet was a staggering 42,000 warships strong. They had crushed 19 other species into submission, swallowing their worlds, their resources, and their people into the ever-expanding machine of the Dominion. By any sane metric, they were one of the 3 most powerful civilizations in the entire galaxy. And Ambassador Saurin was keenly aware of that fact. He had just spent 2 years studying humanity for the Dominion's War Council. Not because anyone was actually worried about the humans, but because those 12 little human systems happened to sit right on top of 3 hyperspace junctions the Dominion desperately wanted. Plus, the minerals in their asteroid belts were worth a king's ransom. The Dominion had been eyeing humanity's territory for decades, and it was Saurin's job to figure out how much of a fight they'd put up. His final report was detailed, confident, and completely, utterly wrong. Humanity poses a negligible military threat, he wrote. Their fleet consists of fewer than 200 ships, mostly small patrol craft and light escorts. They have no significant orbital defenses beyond standard civilian platforms. Their ground forces are estimated to be under 500,000 active personnel, organized in a purely defensive structure. They have no history of aggression, no military alliances, and no visible capacity for a prolonged war. Their economy, while stable, is a drop in the bucket compared to any major galactic power. In summary, he concluded, the acquisition of human territory would be met with minimal resistance and could be completed within a single standard campaign. He delivered this report to the War Council himself, standing tall and proud in the great stone chamber where the Dominion's military elite convened. The room was immense, carved from the volcanic heart of the Bethori homeworld and lit by flames flickering in ancient stone pits. Seated around a long, imposing table were the warlords, each a commander of thousands of ships and millions of soldiers. And at the head of that table sat the supreme warlord himself, Corvth Tyne. Corvth was ancient, even for a Bethari. His scales had deepened to a dark bronze over the centuries, and his body was a roadmap of scars from 100 different battles. One of his golden eyes was a cybernetic replacement, the original lost in a war most beings had long since forgotten. He had commanded the Dominion's military for over 80 years, and in all that time, he had never lost a single campaign. He was brilliant, he was ruthless, and he was absolutely certain of his own superiority. He listened to Sauron's report with the quiet patience of a predator that knows its meal isn't going anywhere. "And their response to diplomatic threats?" Corvth asked, his voice a low rumble, like boulders grinding together. "Historically, they fold," Sauron replied without hesitation. "In every single border dispute, in every trade disagreement, they have consistently chosen to either compromise or flat-out retreat rather than risk escalation. They are, at their core, allergic to conflict." Corvth gave a slow, deliberate nod. He glanced around the table at his warlords and saw exactly what he expected: hunger and eagerness. The Dominion had been at peace for a little too long, and his commanders were getting restless. "Then the matter is settled," Corvth declared. "We will issue the Declaration of Supremacy. The humans will have one solar cycle to surrender their systems and accept their place as our vassals. If they refuse, we will simply take what is ours." The warlords slammed their fists on the stone table in unison. The sound echoed through the chamber like the beating of war drums. "Imagine getting an eviction notice for your entire species. That's basically what landed on the desk of humanity's diplomatic station 2 days later. The document was formal, dripping with the ancient legal jargon of the Vithari Dominion, but the message was brutally simple. They were claiming all 12 human star systems, every resource, every ship, every home. Humanity had 2 options: surrender and become the 20th species to be enslaved by the Dominion, or be wiped from existence by the most terrifying war machine in the galaxy. And the person who received this ultimatum was Ambassador Ilara. At 63 years old, she wasn't what you'd call intimidating. She was of average height, slender, with streaks of gray in her dark hair, which she wore in a simple, no-fuss style. Her face was a roadmap of her years and experience, and her calm brown eyes gave nothing away. She dressed plainly, with no jewelry or fancy fabrics that might hint at power or status. To most aliens, she was the spitting image of a typical human, completely and utterly unremarkable. But there was something about Ilara that set people on edge. It was hard to put your finger on it. It was in the way she'd listen, with a kind of stillness that felt deeper than just being patient. It was in her smile, warm and real, but carrying a hint that she knew secrets you could never guess. It was in how she navigated the treacherous world of diplomacy without ever looking rushed, worried, or scared. Some of her alien colleagues said it was like being around someone who had already read the last page of the book and was just politely waiting for everyone else to get there. She read the Vithari's Declaration of Supremacy from top to bottom, then she read it again. Finally, she placed it on her desk and looked up at the Vithari courier, a young officer in flashy ceremonial armor who was trying way too hard to look menacing. "Thank you," she said, her voice even. "Please tell Supreme Warlord Corvth Tyne that humanity respectfully declines his generous offer." The courier's jaw went slack. "You decline?" "Yes. We have no desire to become your property. We're perfectly happy as we are." "Ambassador," the courier stammered. "I don't think you grasp what refusal means. The Dominion will— "Oh, I understand perfectly," Elara cut in, that unsettling smile playing on her lips. "And I would strongly suggest the Supreme Warlord rethink his plan. A war with humanity will not unfold the way he imagines." The courier just stared at her for a second, then almost burst out laughing. He'd seen the intel reports. 200 ships, no allies, and a military that was a complete joke. This tiny, aging woman was threatening the Vithari Dominion? "I'll deliver your response," he said, his voice thick with amusement as he turned and walked out. Elara watched the door slide shut behind him. For a long moment, she just sat there in the silence. Then she reached into a desk drawer and took out what looked like a plain datapad, but it was far from it. She keyed in a code known to only 7 people in all of human space and spoke just 4 words. "Implement protocol whisper. Confirm." The reply was instantaneous, a single line of text flashing on the screen. "Confirmed. Prometheus active. All systems standing by." Elara put the device away. She leaned back in her chair, gazing out the window at the sea of stars. Somewhere out there, 42,000 Vithari warships were preparing for an easy victory. And somewhere else, across the 12 quiet systems humanity called home, something ancient and powerful was stirring. She thought of the courier and his smug laughter. She thought of the 300 years of being dismissed, of the galaxy's casual contempt that her people had always met with a patient smile. She remembered all the times they'd been called weak, called cowards. And then she thought about what was about to happen when the galaxy finally learned the truth. She didn't feel anger, or excitement, or even a sense of triumph. All she felt was a profound, heavy sadness. Because she knew that once this secret was out, there was no going back. 300 years of carefully built peace. 300 years of being underestimated on purpose. 300 years of choosing quiet patience over foolish pride. It was all about to come to a spectacular end. The galaxy was about to get a lesson on what a species from a death world is truly capable of when it decides to stop being polite. Miles away, on the other side of human space, buried deep beneath the surface of Earth, sat a facility that didn't exist on any map or registry. It was invisible to every scanner, every satellite, every database in the galaxy. A single red light blinked from dormant to active. It was a tiny light on a massive console in a room that hadn't seen a living soul in over 50 years. This room was just one small part of a complex that snaked for miles beneath the planet's crust, shielded by layers of rock, metal, and energy fields that could hide it from anything. It had been built in absolute secrecy over 3 centuries, constantly expanded and upgraded. That little red light meant the entire complex was now awake. And this complex was the brain of something unimaginably vast. An artificial intelligence named Prometheus opened its consciousness for the first time since its last checkup 17 years ago. This wasn't a simple AI, not even by the galaxy's most advanced standards. It was something entirely different. Something humanity had poured 3 centuries of secret research into, creating a mind that made the most sophisticated AIs in the galaxy look like toddlers learning to count. Prometheus reached out its awareness through secret networks that crisscrossed human space. It connected to every human world, every station, and every single ship. It analyzed 300 years of intelligence data, assessed the Vithari threat, and calculated trillions of outcomes and battle plans in the time it takes a human heart to beat just once. Then it broadcast 2 words across the network, and every single human military installation across 12 star systems heard them at the same time. Silence broken. In hidden shipyards carved out of asteroids, lights flickered to life. In secret underground bases on desolate moons, engines began to roar. In the dark voids between planets, where there should have been nothing but emptiness, machines began to stir and things started to move. The quiet time was over, and the galaxy had no idea what was coming for it. The Vithari Dominion hadn't gathered a grand armada in more than a century. The last time was for the conquest of the Yorvith people, a war that lasted 3 weeks and won them 6 star systems. Before that, it was the Shellery, who held out for 2 months, and before that, the Trenith Collective, who fell so fast some historians don't even call it a war. Every Grand Armada in Vithari history had been victorious. Every single one. It was a perfect record stretching back thousands of years, and Supreme Warlord Corvth Tyne was not about to let it be broken. 15,000 warships assembled at the Vithari staging ground, a colossal orbital station named the Iron Fist, which orbited a fortress world near the human border. It was the largest gathering of military might the region had seen in generations. Ships of every shape and size choked the void for thousands of kilometers. Dreadnoughts as big as cities, battle cruisers covered in weapons, and carriers that held swarms of attack craft in their bellies. There were support ships, troop transports, hospital frigates, and electronic warfare vessels. It was a machine designed for one thing and one thing only: total annihilation. Floating at the very center of this storm was the Talon of God, Corvth's personal flagship. It was 6 kilometers long, a mountain of fire and steel shaped like the claw of a giant predator from the Vithari homeworld. It had enough firepower to shatter a planet's crust, and its shields could withstand the fury of an entire fleet. It was the single most powerful warship in the Dominion, and it was Corvath's throne. The ancient warlord stood on the bridge, watching his fleet through the massive viewport. The stars themselves seemed to shrink back, as if even the light was afraid to get too close to such a concentration of power. Corvth felt that old, familiar thrill. This was his purpose, not politics, not diplomacy. This moment, the gathering of overwhelming force just before the kill. His second-in-command, Fleet Marshal Syra, approached with a datapad. She was younger than Corvth by 40 years, lean and sharp, with silver-blue scales that shimmered like liquid metal. She was brilliant, ruthless, and completely loyal. "The fleet is assembled, Supreme Warlord," she reported. 15,000 ships, all at full combat readiness. Troop transports are carrying 2 million ground soldiers. Our supply lines are secure for a 6-month campaign. 6 months? Corvth let out a sound that was the Vithari version of a chuckle. "We won't need 6 days. Syra hesitated. It was almost imperceptible, a pause so brief most would have missed it. But Corvth missed nothing. "You have concerns, Marshal?" "A question, Supreme Warlord, not a concern," Syra said, choosing her words with care. "Our intelligence on human military strength is based on watching from a distance and diplomatic reports. We've never actually scanned one of their warships up close. We've never fought them in a real battle. We don't even have a solid count of their ships. Saren's report was detailed, sure, but it was based on the little data we have. And I'm just pointing out that we have almost nothing. The humans have been unbelievably good at controlling every bit of information that leaves their territory." Corvette stared at her, one eye real, the other a polished prosthetic. "Are you suggesting the humans are hiding something? I'm suggesting that a species from a Category 7 death world that has managed to survive for 300 years in a galaxy full of predators might be a little tougher than their diplomats let on." Corvette thought about it for a second, then brushed it off. "The Morathani survived by hoarding information. The Shalari got by hiding in nebulas. The Yorvet survive by paying off anyone stronger than they are. Species have all sorts of tricks to stay alive that have nothing to do with military power. The humans survive because they're too small and too far away to be worth the fight. That's all there is to it." He turned back to the star-filled view. "We move in 12 hours. Put the fleet on alert." Sarah snapped a salute and walked away. There was no point in arguing. She'd been under Corvette's command long enough to know when his mind was made up. But as she headed back to her post, she couldn't get rid of the cold, heavy feeling in her gut. She'd gone over the human data herself. Not just Sarene's summary, but all the raw intelligence files. And she'd found something that bothered her. It wasn't what was in the files. It was what was missing. In 300 years of contact with the galactic community, humanity had been involved in exactly 0 military incidents, 0 border disputes, and 0 situations where a human warship fired on another vessel, even by mistake. There had been 0 defectors, 0 captured crew members, and 0 intelligence leaks. In a galaxy where even the most paranoid species had slips, a rogue defector, a captured ship, or an intercepted message that gave them away, humanity had given up absolutely nothing. That wasn't the signature of a weak species. That was the signature of a species that was terrifyingly good at keeping secrets. But Sarah kept that thought locked away. The Armada was ready. The command was given. The gears of war were turning, and the gut feeling of one marshal wasn't going to stop them. Across the galaxy, the news of the Vithari mobilization shot through the communication networks like a wildfire. The Galactic Concord spread the story to every known corner of space. The Vithari Dominion was going to annex human territory. 15,000 warships were en route. The humans had refused to surrender. The galaxy's reaction was mixed, but mostly, it was a sad shake of the head. A tragedy, but you could see it coming, the Kelthari ambassador said to the Concord Assembly. A minor species that never bothered to make allies or build a proper defense. The galaxy isn't a kind place for the unprepared. We should probably pass a resolution to show our concern, chimed in the Morathani representative, an insect-like being with 16 eyes that all blinked at different times. Something sympathetic, but non-binding. What's the point? The Kree delegate said flatly. It'll be over before the paperwork even clears committee. No one offered to help. Not a single species, not one government, not one fleet. For 300 years, humanity had been quiet and polite. The result was that when the wolves finally showed up, they were all alone. Or rather, almost all alone. A few people spoke up, but nobody listened to them. The most insistent of these voices was Dr. Lissith Kale. Lissith was a Morathani, one of the insectoid data scholars her kind was known for. She was old, even for a Morathani. Her shell had faded to a chalky gray, and her big compound eyes were getting cloudy around the edges. She walked with a slight limp from an old injury. At first glance, she just looked like a harmless old academic, but she had spent 40 years of her life focused on one subject: humanity. It started out as a small research project. A young Lissith was tasked with cataloging the trade habits of newly discovered species, and humanity was just one of dozens she was studying. But there was something about the humans that grabbed her curiosity and never let it go. It was the little inconsistencies, the holes in the data, the places where information should have been, but just wasn't. Over 4 decades, she put together the single most detailed external analysis of human civilization in existence, and the more she found, the more it scared her. She called for an emergency meeting with the Concord's Intelligence Oversight Committee. They gave her 15 minutes, which was 5 more than she thought she'd get. So she stood in front of a panel of board intelligence officers from 6 different species and laid out her case with the desperation of someone trying to warn a town about an incoming tsunami. The way we measure human military strength is based on a giant mistake, she started. We've assumed that just because we can't see their military, it must not exist. That's like assuming the ocean is only a few feet deep because you can't see the bottom. She brought up her data, 40 years of observations and analysis. First, the human fleet. Our best guess is 200 ships based on what we've seen coming and going through normal hyperspace lanes, but human space is ringed by sensor dead zones they claim are just natural interference. I had 3 separate astrophysics teams look at those zones. The readings don't explain the interference. The dead zone are artificial. The humans are deliberately blinding us from seeing what's inside their borders. The committee members started shifting in their chairs. Their bored looks got a little less bored. Second, their economy. The GDP numbers they report to the Concord are pretty average, but the amount of resources they consume tells a completely different story. They're importing raw materials at a rate 3 to 4 times higher than what their public infrastructure could possibly use. So where is it all going? Their civilian sector can't be using it. Something inside their territory is eating up massive amounts of metal, rare elements, and energy, and we have no idea what it is. She pulled up another chart. Third, they're spending on research and development. As a piece of their total economy, it's 8 times the galactic average. 8 times. The Vithari pour money into military R&D, and even they don't come close to that. The humans are building something. They've been building it for 300 years, and they haven't breathed a word about it to anyone. She stopped, looking at the faces in front of her, and saw the usual reaction. Doubt, a little bit of amusement, and dismissal. Fourth, and this is the most critical part, is the complete lack of information. In 300 years of contact, not a single human military ship has ever been captured or even scanned by another power. Not a single human soldier has ever defected. No intelligence agency in this Concord has ever managed to get a spy inside their military. We've never intercepted a single one of their military communications. That isn't normal. Even the most secretive races in the Concord have leaks sometimes. Humanity has had zero leaks in 300 years. She leaned forward, her voice low. The Vithari Dominion is about to attack a species we know next to nothing about. We've assumed their silence meant they had nothing to say. I believe their silence means they have nothing they need to say. The Vithari are walking into a dark room they haven't measured, and I am terrified of what they're going to find in there. The committee chairman, a big amphibian-like Syrian with a permanent look of being unimpressed, stared at her for a long time. Dr. Kale, we've noted your research. However, the Concord does not get involved in disputes between 2 member states. The Vithari's actions, while aggressive, are within the established rules of engagement. And unless you have actual proof of a specific threat, instead of just the absence of proof, our hands are tied. Lissith just stared at him. The absence of proof is the proof. That is my entire point. Your 15 minutes are up, Doctor. Thank you for your time. Lissith left the room with the slow, heavy steps of someone who had tried their best and knew it just wasn't enough. Her young Morathani research assistant, Orithi, was waiting for her outside. They didn't listen, Orithi stated, even though it was obvious. They never listen, Lissith replied. Not until it's already too late. In the meantime, inside human space, something amazing was taking place. Across all 12 star systems, on every single colony world and orbital station, the civilian populations were moving. Not fleeing, not panicking, just moving. And there was a big difference. On the colony world of New Geneva, in the Corven system, the most remote human settlement and the first target for the Vithari, the evacuation was an absolute masterpiece of precision. Families walked in perfect lines to deep underground shelters that had been carved into the planet's bedrock. Schools let out children in scheduled waves, each group with designated adults guiding them to specific safe zones. Hospitals moved patients into reinforced underground medical centers that, until that very day, had been listed on public maps as simple geological survey stations. There was no chaos, no shouting, no traffic jams of panicked people trying to escape. Every single person seemed to know exactly where they were supposed to go and what they were supposed to do. They all carried pre-packed emergency kits that looked like they had been sitting in a closet, ready and waiting. The kids weren't crying. The parents weren't yelling. People moved with the quiet efficiency of a fire drill that had been practiced over and over again. Because it had been. Every human child, starting at 5 years old, took part in what their schools called safety exercises. They were framed as being as normal as fire drills back on old Earth. Go to this spot. Carry this pack. Follow these instructions. What the children never knew was that these drills were built on top of complex military contingency plans. They had no idea the shelters they practiced running to could survive an orbital bombardment. They didn't know the geological survey stations were actually massive underground cities, capable of keeping entire populations alive for years. But their parents knew, and for 300 years, their parents had been waiting, patiently and quietly. As the very last civilians vanished underground and the sprawling cities on the surface went dark, a completely different kind of activity began. On military bases that technically didn't exist, inside hangars that weren't on any star charts, personnel the galactic community had never heard of reported for duty at stations they had trained their entire lives for. They put on uniforms that no alien eye had ever seen. They checked and loaded weapons that had never once been fired in anger. And ships the galaxy never dreamed existed began their power-up sequences, their deep hum vibrating in the very bones of everyone nearby. Humanity was mobilizing, and it was the quietest, most organized preparation for war the galaxy had never seen. Just 2 hours before the Vithari Armada was set to cross into the first human system, Ambassador R. Vos sat all alone in her office on Thesera Point. By now, the station was almost a ghost town. The entire human staff had been evacuated over the past week, quietly and with zero fuss. R was the only one left. She had one last job to do. She opened a communication channel, but not to the Vithari or the Galactic Concord. She broadcast to the entire galaxy, on every open frequency, every news network, every diplomatic circuit. She wanted every single person to hear this. Her face popped up on screens all across known space, a calm, elderly woman behind a simple desk, with nothing behind her but a plain wall and the logo of the United Earth government. She didn't look scared. She didn't look angry. She just looked sad. "This is Ambassador R. Vos, speaking on behalf of United Earth and all its people," she said. "This is humanity's final diplomatic communication before hostilities commence with the Vithari Dominion." She paused, and the entire galaxy watched. "We want the official record to show the following. Humanity did not ask for this war. In 300 years as members of the Galactic Concord, we have never claimed territory beyond our original 12 systems. We have never attacked anyone. We have never threatened anyone. We have honored every last treaty, every trade agreement, and every single diplomatic promise we ever made. We have been peaceful neighbors and honest partners." She looked right into the camera, and for a second her eyes held an expression that was hard to place. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was something much deeper, something ancient and heavy, like the look a parent gives a child who is about to touch a hot stove. "The Vithari Dominion has decided to declare war on us. They have demanded our unconditional surrender. They have gathered a fleet to seize our worlds by force. We have refused their demands. We have told them, clearly and directly, that this path will not end the way they think it will. They have ignored our warning." She folded her hands on the desk. "So let the record show this. We didn't want this war. We harmed no one. They are choosing this, and I want everyone listening to remember one thing. They chose this." The broadcast ended. The screen went black. On the bridge of the Talon of God, Warlord Korvath Tyne watched the recording with a cold smile. He turned to his second-in-command, Sira. The human female speaks as if she's arguing from a position of strength. It's almost cute. Sira said nothing. "All ships, advance," Korvath commanded. "Take us into their space." The Grand Armada began to move. 15,000 warships slid across the invisible line that marked the border of human territory. In doing so, they crossed another line, one they couldn't see and didn't know was there. It was a line humanity had drawn 3 centuries ago and had prayed every single day since that no one would ever be foolish enough to cross. Just as the fleet entered the first human system, something strange happened. Every single sensor on every single ship in the Vithari Armada glitched at the exact same time. Screens flickered, data streams turned to gibberish, and navigation systems stuttered. It lasted for exactly 0.3 seconds. Then, everything went back to normal. A tiny hiccup, a minor glitch. The sensor officers reported it up the chain of command. "Electronic warfare probes," they concluded. "Standard procedure. The humans are just testing their defenses. It's nothing to worry about." Korvth dismissed it with a flick of his hand. He had no way of knowing that in those 0.3 seconds, an intelligence far beyond anything the galaxy had ever conceived had reached into his fleet, like a hand plunging into a box of toys. Prometheus hadn't just scanned the Vithari ships, it had mapped them. Every single vessel, from the smallest fighter to the Talon of God itself. Shield frequencies, reactor outputs, weapon systems, ammunition levels, hull compositions, structural weak points, communication encryption keys, crew rosters, crew positions, and even the individual neural signatures of every commanding officer in the fleet. In 0.3 seconds, Prometheus knew the Vithari Armada better than the Vithari did themselves. And now, it was calculating. It was running simulations, testing strategies, evaluating 1,000,000 different battles at once, and choosing the perfect approach for every single one. It shared its findings with the human commanders waiting in the dark, hidden corners of their 12 systems, and those commanders looked at the data, nodded, and began moving their forces into position. The trap was being set, and the Vithari were marching right into it with the swagger of a predator that has never encountered anything more dangerous than itself. They were about to get a very harsh lesson on what it means to be wrong about that. The Corbin system wasn't much to see. A medium-sized yellow star, 6 planets. 2 of them were rocky. The rest were gas giants. The second planet, New Geneva, was humanity's most distant colony. It had been terraformed over 2 centuries into a beautiful green world of rolling hills, clean rivers, and small, tidy cities. As of a week ago, about 12 million people had called it home. Now, its surface was dark and silent. The cities stood empty, their lights all switched off. From orbit, the planet looked completely abandoned. Warlord Korvth Tyne led his vanguard into the system with the casual air of a man walking into his own living room. 3,000 warships fanned out across the system in a standard conquest formation, their sensors sweeping and their weapons hot, ready for a fight. What they found was almost nothing. 37 ships, that was it. 37 small black vessels, holding their position in a loose formation near the system's star. They were sleek, built with strange angles that Vithari tactical analysts didn't recognize, and their smooth hulls absorbed almost all light. They had no visible weapon ports, no obvious sensor arrays, no engine nacelles. They looked less like warships, and more like solid shadows. The bridge of the Talon of God fell silent when the count was confirmed. 37, sir, Sira reported, reading the sensor data. She kept her voice perfectly neutral, but Korvth could hear the utter confusion just beneath the surface. 37, Korvth repeated, staring at the tactical display. 37 ships against 3,000. This wasn't even going to be a battle. It was a chore. Perhaps the rest of their fleet is deeper in their territory, Sira suggested. They might be concentrating their forces around their core worlds. Then they are fools, Korvth snapped. You never surrender your outer systems without a fight. It lets the enemy build momentum. He dismissed the 37 ships with a look of contempt. Signal the human vessels. Tell them to power down their engines and surrender. They will be treated as prisoners of war under the Concord's conventions. The signal was sent. The 37 ships didn't reply. They didn't move. They didn't power down. They just hung there, dark and silent, like stones at the bottom of a deep, dark river. Corvus waited. He was a patient hunter, but his patience was wearing thin. "No response, Supreme Warlord," the communications officer reported. "Send the signal again." Still nothing. Corvus's golden eyes narrowed. He hated being ignored. In Vithari culture, being ignored was one of the greatest insults you could deliver. These 37 pathetic little ships weren't even acknowledging his existence. It was an insult, whether they meant it to be or not. And Corvus did not suffer insults. "Send the vanguard," he said, his voice cold. 500 ships. Destroy them." The order shot through the fleet, and 500 Vithari warships broke from the main formation, accelerating toward the 37 human vessels. They were a mix of cruisers and destroyers, fast, heavily armed, and each crewed by hundreds of elite Vithari warriors. They moved with the deadly precision of a species that had been conquering star systems for 6,000 years. They closed the distance in moments. At optimal weapons range, the Vithari squadron commander gave the order to fire. 500 ships opened fire at the exact same time. Lances of plasma, batteries of kinetic slugs, and swarms of guided torpedoes lit up the void between the fleets with enough raw power to crack a planet's moon. And every single shot missed. They didn't just miss in the way shots sometimes miss in the chaos of battle, where a target dodges or a weapon system fails. They missed in a way that should have been physically impossible. The 37 human ships had moved, but they moved in a way nothing that large had any right to move. One moment they were in one place, and the next, they were simply somewhere else. And the space where they used to be was filled with Vithari weapons fire, hitting absolutely nothing. The acceleration readings flooding the Vithari sensors simply made no sense. The math on the screen was a joke. It had to be, because if those numbers were real, the G-forces alone would have turned every crew member inside those tiny ships into a fine red mist on the back wall. And yet, the ships kept moving, kept weaving, kept being anywhere but where the weapons were aimed. And then, the human ships fired back. There were no warning shots, no honorable exchange of broadsides, no slow buildup. 1 second, 37 human ships were dancing through Vithari firepower like autumn leaves in a hurricane. The next, they unleashed hell. The weapons they used weren't in any galactic catalog. They were kinetic slugs, sure, but they were moving at speeds the Vithari had only ever considered a theoretical impossibility for ship-mounted cannons. The projectiles slammed into them at a staggering fraction of the speed of light, but when they hit the Vithari shields, they didn't splash or sizzle across the surface like normal kinetic rounds. They just passed right through, clean as a whistle, as if the shields weren't even there. Beams of focused energy followed, striking with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Each blast was tuned to a frequency that perfectly matched the harmonic resonance of Vithari shield tech. It was like someone had been handed the master key to every single Vithari shield generator and built weapons specifically designed to ignore them, which, of course, is exactly what had happened. In just 0.3 seconds, an intelligence named Prometheus had cracked their shield codes. And now, every single human weapon in the system was calibrated to slide past Vithari defenses like a key slipping into a perfectly matched lock. The 500 Vithari warships began to die. It happened fast. It wasn't glorious or dramatic. There were no massive fireballs, no ships spiraling into a slow, agonizing death. The human weapons hit, and the Vithari ships simply ceased to be. One moment, a proud, powerful warship filled with living souls was there. The next, it was just an expanding cloud of superheated vapor and tumbling bits of metal. The battle, if you could even call it that, was over in 4 minutes. When the silence returned, The 37 human ships went back to their original positions, hanging in the void, dark and quiet, just waiting. 500 Vathari warships were gone. Every last one of them. The humans hadn't lost a single ship. They hadn't even taken a single hit. On the command bridge of the Talon of God, the silence was deafening. It wasn't the calm silence of a crew confident in its victory, but the ringing silence you feel after being slapped hard across the face. Officers stared blankly at their screens. Data techs ran the numbers again and again, desperately searching for some error. Any error. Weapons experts replayed the combat logs frame by agonizing frame, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Corvette Tyne stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of stone. His hands gripped the command railing so tightly that his claws bit into the metal, leaving deep grooves behind. The Seraph approached him cautiously. "Supreme Warlord, 500 ships lost. 0 enemy casualties. Their weapons bypassed our shields without any resistance. Their evasive maneuvers are beyond anything in our tactical archives. The Vanguard fleet is a total loss." For a long moment, Korvth said nothing. Then, his voice came out steady and cold. "A trick? It was electronic warfare. They spoofed our sensors, scrambled our targeting systems. They got lucky and exploited a momentary glitch. It won't happen a second time." He drew himself up to his full height. "Send 3,000 ships. Full assault formation. I want overwhelming force. I want those 37 ships reduced to cosmic dust." The Seraph hesitated. "Supreme Warlord, perhaps we should reconsider. 3,000 ships, Marshal. Now." 3,000 Vathari warships surged into the black. This time, they flew in a tight combat sphere, their shields overlapping, their fire patterns perfectly coordinated, leaving absolutely no gaps for the nimble human ships to slip through. It was a textbook formation for crushing a smaller, faster enemy that relied on speed and tricks. The Vathari had used it 100 times before. It had never failed. Then the 37 human ships did something no one expected. They turned tail and ran. They accelerated away from the massive Vathari fleet, streaking toward the system's largest gas giant, a colossal planet of swirling orange and brown storms that the humans had nicknamed Jotunheim. A grim smile touched Korvith's lips as he watched the retreat. "They're running, just as I predicted. Pursue them. Do not let them escape into hyperspace." The 3,000 Vathari ships gave chase. They were incredibly fast, but the human ships were just a little bit faster, maintaining a distance just outside of weapons range, but close enough to keep the Vathari fleet hot on their heels. It was a game of cat and mouse, and Korvth saw right through it. The humans were trying to lure them out, to stretch their tight formation and create an opening. He wouldn't take the bait. He kept his fleet in its impenetrable sphere and maintained a steady pursuit. The human ships couldn't run forever. Sooner or later they'd have to turn and fight, or abandon the system completely. Either way, Korvth would have his victory. The chase brought them right to the edge of Jotunheim. The gas giant was immense, filling the main view screen like an ancient, angry god. Its atmosphere was a boiling sea of storms and lightning. The 37 human ships dove towards the planet, then whipped around it, using its massive gravity well to perform a slingshot maneuver that flung them back towards the Vathari fleet at a mind-boggling speed. It was a bold move, but a standard one. Korvth calmly adjusted his formation to meet the incoming charge and prepared to open fire. He never got the chance. The clouds of Jotunheim erupted. From the violent upper atmosphere of the gas giant, hidden from any sensor by the planet's powerful magnetosphere, a fleet began to rise. Ships emerged from the storm clouds, like colossal sea monsters surfacing from the deepest ocean. They came in wave after wave, and they just kept coming. Dreadnoughts, carriers, heavy cruisers, battleships, ship classes the galaxy had never even conceived of, built with alien designs and bristling with weapons that defied identification. They were pitch black, just like the first 37, their hulls seeming to drink the light from the stars. They rose from the churning clouds of Jotunheim, unfolding into a vast formation like the petals of some terrifying, world-ending flower. The sheer number of them made the Vithari sensors glitch and reset. 600 ships, 600 warships had been hiding in the upper atmosphere of a gas giant, completely invisible, just waiting for the Vithari to step into the perfect position. Waiting for the 37 ships to lead them there like a matador leading an angry bull into the ring. The trap snapped shut. The 3,000 Vithari ships were suddenly caught between the 37 decoys that had turned to face them and 600 fresh warships closing in from above and below. It was a killing box, a three-dimensional cage of firepower with no way out. The battle that followed lasted much longer than the first one, but only because there were so many more ships to destroy. The human fleet fought with a perfect coordination that was almost supernatural. Every ship seemed to know exactly what every other ship was going to do before it did it. There were no near collisions, no friendly fire incidents, not a single wasted maneuver. When one ship fired, another was already moving to exploit the opening it created. If a Vithari vessel tried to focus its fire on a single human ship, 3 others would instantly converge on it from impossible angles. It was less like watching a fleet battle and more like watching a single, massive organism with 637 bodies. Because, in a way, that's exactly what it was. Prometheus was coordinating the entire human fleet at once, processing the whole battle in real time, adjusting tactics on a microsecond by microsecond basis, and exploiting every single weakness the instant it appeared. The human crews flew their ships, but Prometheus was fighting the war. And Prometheus never made mistakes. The Vithari fought with courage. No one could ever deny them that. They were a warrior race, born and bred for battle, and they did not surrender or run. Captains who found themselves hopelessly outgunned chose to ram their own ships into the human fleet rather than retreat. Squadron leaders rallied their wings again and again, desperately trying to punch a hole in the closing net. Individual crews fought their ships until the very hulls were melting around them. But bravery wasn't enough. Not against this. Not against an enemy that knew the precise location of every shield weakness, every vulnerable reactor, and every ammo storage bay that was just one well-placed shot away from a catastrophic explosion. Not against an enemy that moved with the speed of pure thought and struck with the unerring precision of a god. 2 hours after the ambush from the gas giant, it was over. The Corvin system had become a graveyard, littered with the broken wreckage of 3,500 Vithari warships. Clouds of debris and cooling metal stretched for millions of kilometers. Tiny emergency beacons blinked among the ruins, marking the life pods where the few surviving Vithari crews waited for a rescue that might never come. The human fleet had lost 0 ships. Not a single one. 637 human warships hung in the silent void, surrounded by the ruins of the Vithari vanguard. Undamaged, undiminished, dark, and silent. On the bridge of the Talon of God, which had watched from the edge of the system, Corvth Tyne just stared at the tactical display, showing the utter annihilation of his fleet. The main view screen was a sea of crimson. Red icons marked the graves of dead ships, red zones warned of treacherous debris fields, and red alerts screamed about communication blackouts. The bridge crew was frozen in a stunned silence. They were terrified. Corvith could smell it on them, that sharp chemical odor their Vithari bodies released when gripped by fear. He couldn't blame them. What they had just witnessed wasn't a battle. It was an execution. "Supreme Warlord," Sira said, her voice barely a whisper. She was the only one who seemed capable of speech. "Losses confirmed at 3,512 ships. Enemy losses confirmed at 0. Our vanguard is gone." Corvith remained silent. The human fleet was just holding its position, not advancing, not even chasing down the survivors. She took a shaky breath. They seem to be waiting. Right on cue, a message came through, broadcast on an open channel for everyone to hear. A human voice, impossibly calm and clear. Vithari Fleet, this is the United Earth Navy, Corvin System Defense Command. You have entered sovereign human territory and attacked our forces. Your advance fleet has been neutralized. We have no desire to continue this fight. You have seen what we can do. We are asking you now, plainly and simply, to withdraw from our space. If you leave in peace, we will not follow. All captured personnel and recovered escape pods will be released through neutral parties. This is your one chance. Take it. The message clicked off, leaving an even deeper silence on the bridge. Corv stared at the screen. He stared at the 600 enemy ships floating serenely amidst the wreckage of his armada. He stared at the numbers, the horrible, impossible numbers that confirmed he had lost over 3,500 warships without leaving a single scratch on the enemy. And then, something broke inside him. Something that hadn't happened in 80 years of command, in 100 battles fought and won. Something the supreme warlord of the Vithari Dominion, the most celebrated commander in his civilization's history, had never, ever felt before. He felt doubt. It lasted for about 3 seconds. Then that doubt was swallowed whole by something much older, much stronger. Rage. It was a pure, burning, volcanic rage, the fury of a predator that has been utterly humiliated, the fury of a conqueror tasting his first real defeat, the fury of an old warrior realizing his entire understanding of the enemy was a lie, a warrior who would rather burn the galaxy to cinders than admit he was wrong. No, he snarled. Sira flinched. We do not retreat, Corv said, his voice low and lethal. We do not surrender, and we do not accept mercy from a species we came here to conquer. Signal the homeworld. Signal every ship, every reserve, every single vessel that can fight. I want them all here. He turned to Sira, his eyes blazing. Supreme Warlord, their strength is a lesson. Now I know what they are, he finished, and I will bring a force so large it can break them, no matter what. 27,000 ships remain in the Dominion fleet. Summon every last one of them. Sira stared at him, the protest dying on her lips. She wanted to tell him that what they saw today suggested that even 27,000 ships might not be enough. She wanted to point out that those 600 ships might just be a fraction of what humanity had waiting in their 12 star systems. She desperately wanted to ask the question screaming in her mind, if this is what the humans have in just one system, what in the stars is waiting for us in the other 11? But she was Vithari, and the Vithari do not question their supreme warlord. She gave the order. Far across the galaxy, on the Marathani homeworld, Dr. Lissith Kyle sat in her research office, watching the same battle data being leaked from Vithari channels. Her large, compound eyes processed the flood of information with the incredible speed of her species. With every new packet of data, her dread grew heavier. Her young assistant, Orthi, stood just behind her, watching the same feeds. 600 ships, Orthi whispered in disbelief, hiding inside a gas giant's atmosphere. How long could they have been there? Long enough to be completely invisible when the Vithari scanned the system before their attack, Lissith replied, without looking away. They were waiting. This was a trap. Every single second of this was planned. The Vithari are calling for reinforcements. Their entire remaining fleet. Lissith closed her eyes for a moment. Yes, and it won't matter. How can you possibly know that? Lissith turned to face her young assistant, her ancient eyes carrying the weight of 40 years spent studying the one species the rest of the galaxy had dismissed as uninteresting. Because those 600 ships came from one system, she said softly. One system out of 12. And the humans have been building in absolute secrecy for 300 years. She turned back to her screens. The Vithari are going to throw everything they have at them, and it won't be enough. Nothing will be enough. The galaxy has made a catastrophic mistake, Orthy. We looked at the humans, and we saw what we wanted to see. A quiet, harmless species that wasn't worth our time. She pulled up a map of human space, 12 little dots on the galactic fringe. The same map everyone had looked at and seen as a sign of weakness. We should have asked ourselves one simple question, she said. We should have asked why a species from a death world, a species born in violence, hardened by suffering, a species that survived everything their planet could throw at them and then clawed their way into orbit on rockets made of controlled explosions. Why would a species like that choose to be so quiet? We assumed they were broken. We assumed they were afraid. She stared at the map, at those 12 little dots that suddenly seemed to loom like giants. They weren't afraid. They were patient. And now, their patience has run out. Far, far away, across the vast emptiness of space, human trade delegations and diplomatic staff were quietly packing up their offices. In conquered stations, neutral ports, and alien capitals all across the galaxy, humans were calmly closing up shop and heading home. There were no grand announcements, no explanations offered, just a steady, organized withdrawal of every human from territory that wasn't their own. It was the final warning. A warning the galaxy wouldn't understand until it was far too late. The humans were clearing the board. The real war hadn't even begun. It took the Vithari Dominion 11 days to gather its full military might. For 11 days, ships poured in from 900 star systems, from remote garrisons and lonely patrol routes, from training stations and reserve docks, all converging on a single staging point at the edge of human space. It was the total mobilization of one of the galaxy's greatest military powers, and it was a sight of terrible beauty. 27,000 fresh warships joined the 11,000 battered survivors of the Corvin system disaster, a fleet of 38,000 warships in total. The number was almost too large to grasp. When the fleet assembled in formation, it occupied a volume of space bigger than most solar systems. Its combined firepower could, in theory, scour an entire planet of life in a matter of hours. It was the largest concentration of military power the galaxy had seen in more than 1,000 years. Corvith stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Talon of God, and gazed upon his grand armada. He hadn't slept well in the 11 days since Corvin. The memory of those 600 black ships rising like ghosts from the clouds of a gas giant played on a loop in his mind. And every time he saw it, the rage in his soul burned hotter. He had been surprised. He had been beaten. And worst of all, he had been offered mercy. He would not be surprised again. His strategy was brutally simple, overwhelming force. He would divide his 38,000 ships into 12 massive strike groups, one for each human star system. He would hit all 12 systems at the exact same time, giving the humans no chance to rally their forces. Even if every single system had 600 ships like Corvin did, that was only a total of 7,200 warships. His smallest fleet would outnumber them more than 5 to 1. The simple math of war was on his side. Sira had respectfully pointed out that the 600 ships at Corvin might not have been the only human forces in that system, that there could be more. Corvith had acknowledged the possibility and simply increased the size of each strike group. The 12 groups ranged from 2,000 ships for the smaller, outer systems to 5,000 for what they presumed were the human core worlds. "If they have more than we expect," Corvith had said, "we will overwhelm them with numbers. If they have less, we will overwhelm them with speed. Either way, we overwhelm them. That is the Vithari way." Sira had nodded and said nothing more. But later, in the privacy of her quarters, she wrote a personal message to her family, sealing it for delivery in the event of her death. She had a terrible feeling she wouldn't survive the coming days. Not because she was a coward, but because she was smart enough to be afraid of what the humans might truly be, and wise enough to know that her warlord was not. On the 12th day, the Vithari Grand Armada made its move. 12 strike groups, 38,000 warships, splitting apart and plunging into human space through 12 different hyperspace corridors, each aimed at a different star system. The level of coordination was staggering, a testament to the Vithari's millennia of military tradition. Nearly every ship arrived at its target system within minutes of the others. The timing was nearly perfect, and it didn't matter at all. Because as the 12 Vithari strike groups dropped out of hyperspace into 12 human star systems, a single command was issued from a hidden command center named Prometheus. The command activated Protocol Fenris, and the galaxy changed forever. The sensor-dead zones that had always surrounded human space were never natural. They were a curtain, a sophisticated wall of engineered interference maintained by thousands of hidden satellites. For 300 years, that curtain had hidden what humanity was truly building. Now, with the enemy inside the walls, there was no longer any reason to hide. It was supposed to be a final, crushing blow. The Vithari fleet, 30,000 strong, had come to extinguish a tiny, upstart species. The commander, Korbth, sent his strike group into the Corven system, expecting to swat aside the 600 human ships he'd seen before. But as the curtain of hyperspace dropped, every Vithari sensor screamed in unison. The tactical displays didn't just light up, they exploded with contacts. This wasn't 600 ships. It wasn't 1,000 or even 2,000. The count just kept climbing as ghost ships flickered into existence, powering up from silent asteroid fields, rising from beneath camouflage on desolate moons, and detaching from the dark sides of planets where they had waited, cold and patient, for years. The Corven system alone held over 2,000 human warships, and it wasn't a fluke. Across a dozen star systems, the same terrifying scene was playing out on the bridge of every Vithari ship. Humans were everywhere. They had always been there, hiding in the dark, in the blind spots, in all the places no one ever bothered to look. When the master AI, Prometheus, finished waking every hidden asset, the grand total was staggering, over 18,000 purpose-built warships, not the 200 the galaxy thought they had. 18,000 ships, forged in secret yards carved into asteroids and barren worlds over 3 centuries of silent preparation. But the ships were just the opening act. The real nightmare was the defense platforms, hundreds of thousands of them. Tiny automated weapon stations seeded throughout every system like a celestial minefield. They were cheap, throwaway guns packed with the same shield-shredding technology that had annihilated the Vithari vanguard. Alone, they were gnats. Together, they turned every cubic kilometer of human space into a death trap. And then there were the weapons themselves. For 300 years, humanity had poured 8 times the galactic average budget into secret research, creating technology so advanced it felt like magic. The most terrifying of all was the skip drive. It was a tiny hyperspace engine that let a ship make micro-jumps right in the middle of a battle. A human cruiser could be right in front of you, and in the blink of an eye, it was behind you, tearing into your engines before your targeting computer even knew it was gone. In 12 different star systems, the Vithari strike groups faced the full, terrible weight of humanity's 300-year-long plan for a war they never wanted. And in all 12 systems, the same one-sided slaughter began. The biggest fight was in the Sol system, around Earth itself, where 5,000 of the Vithari's best ships had come to deliver the killing blow. The Vithari fleet dropped out of hyperspace ready for a fight. What they got was an apocalypse. 4,000 human warships were waiting for them, locked in a perfect formation that sealed off every path to the inner planets. And at the heart of that formation sat a vessel so massive it made the Vithari flagship, the Talon of God, look like a tiny patrol boat. It was the USS Quiet Resolve, the flagship of the United Earth Navy, and it was 3 times the size of anything the Vithari had ever built. But the quiet resolve didn't fire. None of the human ships did. They just waited, giving the Vithari 5 full minutes to look at their screens, to count the numbers, and to truly understand the catastrophic mistake they had made. Then, a message was broadcast across all channels, the exact same words in all 12 systems. Vithari forces, you are outnumbered and outgunned. We have detailed knowledge of your fleet's layout, your shield frequencies, and your weapon capabilities. We can annihilate you. We are offering you 1 chance to withdraw. You have 5 minutes to begin a full retreat. If you leave now, you will not be pursued. If you stay, we will engage with overwhelming force. There will be no second warning. 5 minutes. It was an eternity in a battle, just long enough for every Vithari commander to stare at the impossible odds on their screens and realize the war they came for was not the war they had found. In a few systems, the Vithari commanders were smart enough to see the obvious. They ordered an immediate retreat, and true to their word, the human ships simply let them go. But in most systems, the Vithari were, well, Vithari, proud, stubborn warriors who had never known defeat. They saw the impossible odds and, fueled by pure arrogance, they charged. The battles were brutally short. The 18,000 human ships moved like a single organism, guided by the Prometheus AI, executing a flawless strategy that countered every Vithari move before it was even made. The skip drives turned the battle into a phantom menace. A Vithari squadron would unleash a full volley at a group of human ships, only for their shots to hit empty space. The targets had already jumped behind them and were blowing their unshielded engines to pieces. The defense platforms just added to the chaos, creating deadly crossfires that shredded any ship that tried to break formation and run. Those that fled were picked apart by weapons they couldn't even see on their sensors, and through it all, the humans fought with that same cold, terrifying professionalism. There was no fury in their attacks, no rage or bloodlust. They fought like a surgeon performing a delicate operation, with precision, with efficiency, and with a complete focus on the task. They didn't waste a single shot. They didn't overkill their targets. They didn't fire on escape pods or disabled vessels. Every shot had one purpose: to end the fight as quickly as possible with the least amount of destruction. And that, more than the ships or the tech, is what truly broke the Vithari. Cruelty they could understand. Rage they could respect. But this calm, methodical dismantling of their entire military spoke of a species that saw war not as a glorious conquest, but as a tragic, regrettable failure that had to be cleaned up. The fact that the humans weren't enjoying this made it so much worse. The 12 battles across human space lasted just 6 hours. When it was over, the Grand Armada, 38,000 ships strong, had simply ceased to exist. Over 34,000 Vithari warships were gone. The military that had fueled 6,000 years of conquest was utterly broken. And humanity? They lost 214 ships. In the bloodiest battle of the century, humanity's losses were a rounding error, but the war wasn't over. For the first time in 300 years, human warships crossed their own border. A fleet of 5,000 ships, led by the Quiet Resolve, made a single, perfect hyperspace jump, arriving at the one place the Vithari believed was untouchable: their home world. Veth Prime was an ancient planet of red stone under a dying orange sun. For 6 millennia, it had been the heart of their dominion. Its magnificent cities, carved from volcanic rock, were a testament to a civilization at the peak of its power. It was supposed to be the most heavily defended planet in the galaxy, surrounded by orbital forts and patrolling warships. But the warships were all gone, turned to scrap in human space. The orbital platforms were still there, but they were built to handle pirates, not a fleet of 5,000 ships armed with technology from the future. The human fleet appeared without any warning at all. One moment, the skies above Veth Prime were clear. The next, 5,000 ships materialized in the void, a dark cloud blotting out the sun. The orbital platforms immediately opened fire. The human fleet dismantled them in 11 minutes. The strikes were clean and precise, disabling weapons and power systems without actually destroying the stations. The Vithari crews were left alive, floating helplessly in their dead platforms, watching in horror as the human fleet took up a silent, perfect orbit around their world. Then, the fleet went completely still. The weapons fell silent. The ships just hung there in the sky like dark monuments, their massive hulls blocking out the stars. Then, a message went out. It blanketed every single frequency, every communication system on the planet of Vithar Prime. It cut through military channels, civilian broadcasts, emergency networks, and even personal devices. Every last Vithari heard it, from the top government officials in the capital city to the smallest child in a remote village. "People of Vithar Prime," a calm voice began. "This is the United Earth Navy. Your fleet is gone. Your warriors are dead, captured, or running. We are now in orbit above your world. We have the power to wipe your civilization from existence in a matter of hours. But we will not do this. We are not conquerors. We are not destroyers. We are not the monsters you tried to turn us into." The message wasn't finished. "We are offering you these terms: an immediate and unconditional end to all fighting, the withdrawal of all Vithari military forces from every territory you've disputed, the release of all 19 species you currently hold as subjects of your dominion, and you will pay reparations, not to us, but to those species you've oppressed. Finally, you will broadcast a formal, public apology to the entire galactic Concord. In exchange, your homeworld will remain untouched. Your civilization will not be torn down. Your people will not be harmed. Your culture will be allowed to continue. You will remain a sovereign nation." There was a pause. "You have one solar cycle to accept these terms. We will wait." And wait they did. 5,000 warships just hung in the sky above a world of billions. And they did nothing. They didn't fire a single shot. They made no threats. They didn't even adjust their position. They just floated there, a silent demonstration of absolute power being held in perfect check. Across the galaxy, the galactic Concord absolutely exploded. News of the 12 battles had flashed across faster-than-light networks within hours, made even more shocking by how impossible it all seemed. A minor species with a fleet of 200 ships had just revealed itself to be a military superpower with 18,000 warships and technology that was decades ahead of everyone else. The Vithari Dominion, one of the 3 most powerful civilizations in the entire galaxy, had been completely crushed in a single day. Now, human warships were orbiting the Vithari home world. Every government, every military, and every intelligence agency in the Concord was crunching the same numbers and coming to the same terrifying conclusion. Humanity wasn't just strong. Humanity might be the single most powerful military force in the galaxy. They had been for years, maybe decades, or even longer. And all that time, they had said nothing, done nothing, and taken nothing. The Concord Assembly called for an emergency session. The chamber, a massive circular hall with room for representatives from 4,000 species, was packed for the first time in years. Every single seat was taken. Every delegation was there. The noise was a deafening roar of 1,000 alien voices shouting in 100 different languages, all asking the same panicked questions. How did we not know? How could we have missed this? What do we do now? And then Dr. Lissith Kyle was given the floor. Not because anyone had officially invited her, but because the Morathani delegation, finally realizing the true value of her 40 years of research, had insisted that everyone listen to her. She walked to the speaker's platform on her old, limping legs, looked out at the 4,000 species worth of terrified faces, and she spoke. "I told you," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the chamber had fallen completely silent to hear her, and her words echoed. "I stood before your intelligence committee, and I told you that the lack of evidence was the evidence, that their silence wasn't weakness, and that we had no idea what was hiding behind their borders." She brought up a display showing the now confirmed human fleet strength, 18,000 warships and hundreds of thousands of defense platforms. It was technology that the Concord's brightest minds were still struggling to comprehend. For 300 years, we had the most dangerous species in the galaxy living right next door, and we called them cowards. We laughed at them in our halls of power. We cracked jokes about their tiny fleet and their quiet diplomats. We patted them on the head and treated them like children. Her voice grew hard. And when the Vithari came for them, not a single one of us lifted a finger to help. Not one. 4,000 species in this Concord, and not a single one offered the humans so much as a sympathetic vote. We left them to die because we thought they were weak, because helping the weak is inconvenient, and because weak species just don't matter. She scanned the room. And now we find out they weren't weak at all. They were the strongest of all of us. They had the power to rule this galaxy, and they chose not to. They had the strength to take whatever they wanted, and they wanted nothing but to be left alone. Every single peaceful day we've enjoyed for the last 300 years was because they chose it. They chose to be gentle when they could have chosen to conquer. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The silence in the chamber was so thick you could feel it. And you called them cowards. She turned and left the platform without saying another word. The chamber stayed silent for a very long time after she was gone. On Vithar Prime, Warlord Korvath Tien received the surrender demand aboard his crippled flagship. It had barely managed to limp home through hyperspace, its engines failing and its hull torn open in 7 different places. He had survived the disaster in the Corbin system by retreating to his command ship, the Talon of God, the moment he knew the battle was lost. He had watched his entire fleet get torn to shreds from the bridge of his dying ship. He had seen the numbers. He understood exactly what they meant. Now he sat in his quarters on the Talon of God as it drifted helplessly in orbit above his own home world, surrounded by 5,000 enemy ships. And he read the human terms of surrender. He read them once, quickly. Then he read them again, much more slowly. Then he read them a 3rd time because he simply couldn't believe what he was seeing. The terms were lenient. They weren't just lenient, they were generous. Humanity was demanding almost nothing for itself. No territory, no resources, no occupation, no change in government. They just wanted the Vithari to stop fighting and to let their vassal species go, and to apologize. That was pretty much it. Korvath had conquered 19 species in his time. He knew what conquest terms were supposed to look like. He had written them himself. Seizing territory, demanding rights to resources, crippling their military, restructuring their government, installing occupation forces and puppet rulers, and forcing them through rituals of humiliation. Those were the tools of a conqueror, and Korvath had used every single one of them. The humans were using none of them. It didn't make any sense. They had won. They had won a victory so total and complete it was staggering. Their fleet was above his world, and his fleet was nothing but space debris. They could take anything they wanted, everything, and yet they were asking for almost nothing. Syrah, his second in command, entered his quarters. She had survived the battles too. but she looked like she had aged a decade in the last 12 days. Her silver-blue scales were dull, and her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. "The War Council has disbanded," she said quietly. "The civilian government is requesting your authorization to accept the human terms." Korvath just sat in his chair, staring at the document on his screen. The terms that asked for almost nothing from a species that could have taken everything. "Why?" he said, the word coming out as barely a whisper. "Supreme Warlord? Why these terms? Why not take our worlds? Why not shatter what's left of our fleet, scatter our people, and make us the 20th vassal species in their collection?" He looked up at Sira, and for the first time in her long years of service to him, she saw pure confusion in his golden eyes. Not anger, not pride, just confusion. "This is not how war works," he said. "This is not how victory works. You either destroy your enemy, or you make them serve you. Those are the only two options. They have always been the only options." "Perhaps not for them," Sira suggested. Korvath just stared at her. Then he looked down at the ceremonial blade at his belt. It was ancient, forged from the volcanic glass of Vithar Prime, sharper than any metal and darker than night. It was the symbol of the Supreme Warlord's office, a symbol of Vathari defiance and strength. No Supreme Warlord in 6,000 years had ever surrendered it. He drew the blade from its sheath. He held it in his hands for a long moment, feeling its weight. The weight of 6,000 years of conquest and pride and of never ever yielding to an enemy. Then he gently set it down on the table. "I yield," he said. "Accept the terms." Word of the surrender flashed across the galaxy at the speed of light. The Vathari Dominion, undefeated for 6 millennia, had surrendered unconditionally to the humans. The war was over. It had lasted just 11 days. And then, Ambassador Voss appeared before the Galactic Concord. She hadn't given any advanced notice. She hadn't requested a special session. She simply arrived at the Concord Assembly Chamber, took her seat in the human delegation's modest section up on the upper tier, where the minor species were placed, and asked to be recognized. She was recognized instantly. Every eye, every sensor, every appendage in that massive hall turned towards her. She stood. She was still the same woman, still small, still gray-haired, still dressed in simple clothing. And she still had that warm, sad smile that suddenly made so much more sense than it ever had before. "We never wanted you to see this," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the chamber was so silent you could have heard a pin drop. "We built our strength so that we would never have to use it. We stayed quiet so that we would never have to speak. We wanted nothing more than to live peacefully in our 12 systems, to trade with our neighbors, and to just be left alone." She looked around the chamber at 4,000 species, 4,000 civilizations, all of them looking at her with brand new eyes. "Now you know what we are, and I understand that things can never go back to the way they were. You're going to see us differently now. You'll think about us in a new light. Those quiet neighbors you had at the edge of the galaxy, they're gone. And what you see in their place is something that scares you." She took a breath. "And we're sorry for that. We truly are. Not for defending ourselves. We will never apologize for that. But for the fact that you had to witness it. We're sorry that 3 centuries of peace, patience, and carefully chosen silence were wiped away in just 11 days. We built a world where we could afford to be gentle. And now that world is gone." She sat down, and the silence that filled the chamber was a kind no one in the galaxy had ever heard before. It was the silence of 4,000 species realizing, all at once, that they had never truly understood the meaning of the word strength. 6 months went by. The galaxy kept on turning. Trade routes stayed busy, and diplomatic channels remained open. The Galactic Concord held its meetings, passed its resolutions, and carried on with business as usual. On the surface, the great engine of interstellar civilization rumbled on just as it always had. But underneath, everything had shifted. Nothing was the same, and everyone knew it, even if they couldn't find the words to say why. The Vithari-human war had lasted for 11 days. Just 11 days from the first shot fired in the Corvin system to the moment Corvith Tyne laid down his blade on the deck of his shattered flagship. In those 11 days, the Vithari Dominion lost over 34,000 warships. Millions of their soldiers and crew members were either killed, captured, or left adrift in escape pods, which humanity then meticulously collected. The most formidable military machine in the galaxy, built over 6,000 years of relentless conquest, had been completely taken apart in less than 2 weeks. Humanity, on the other hand, lost 214 ships and roughly 6,000 people. The numbers were officially published by the Conquered, and every species that read them felt the exact same thing. It wasn't surprise or admiration, it was fear, a deep, primal fear that came from finally understanding just how vast the gap was between human capabilities and their own. But then that fear was mixed with something else, something far more confusing, because of what humanity did next. The terms of surrender were followed to the letter. The Vithari pulled back from 3 contested border systems, not their home territory, just disputed zones they'd argued over for decades. The 19 species they held as vassals were set free. All of them, every single one. Cultures that had been ground under the Vithari heel for centuries were suddenly independent, their chains shattered not by their own power, but by a species most had never even met. Reparations were paid, but not to humanity. The humans asked for nothing. The money went to the freed vassal species, calculated based on the economic ruin they had suffered and handed out by a neutral Conquered committee. Humanity didn't even oversee the payments. They just built the system, paid for the startup costs from their own funds, and then stepped away. The Vithari issued a formal apology. It was broadcast by the new civilian government that replaced the military council, and it was stiff, awkward, and obviously painful for a people who hadn't apologized for anything in 6,000 years. But it was genuine, it was public, and the whole galaxy heard it. And then, the humans just went home. That was the part nobody could wrap their head around. Their warships returned to hidden docks within their 12 systems. The sensor curtain went back up, though now everyone knew it was there. Their trade ships started flying their old routes, carrying the same cargo as always. Ambassador Ilara Voss went back to her office on the Citadel, resumed her usual diplomatic routine, attended Conquered sessions, voted on small resolutions, and wore that same warm, unsettling smile. It was as if the war never even happened. As if the most powerful force in the galaxy had just shrugged, tucked itself back into its 12 quiet systems, and went back to being the boring neighbors no one ever thought about. Except now, everyone was thinking about them. The first to send a delegation to Earth were the Turi, one of the 19 freed Vithari vassals. They were a small, gentle people, soft-bodied and slow-moving, with big, dark eyes and delicate hands made for creating art, not for war. They had been conquered by the Vithari 400 years ago, and their suffering had been immense. Their culture was stamped out, their people forced into harsh labor, and their homeworld stripped bare of its resources. They had endured it all with a quiet sadness, because they had no other choice. Now they were free, and they had no idea what to do with that freedom. The Turi delegation came to Earth fully expecting to meet their new masters. It was the only pattern they knew. One conqueror is replaced by another. The boot on your neck changes, but your head stays bowed. They brought gifts, tribute, and all the symbols of submission. They were ready to pledge their loyalty, their resources, and their obedience to the ones who had broken their old chains. What they discovered left them utterly bewildered. The humans didn't want their submission. They didn't want their tribute. They didn't even really want their gratitude. though they accepted it with grace. What they wanted, as the humans explained with the patient warmth of people who saw this coming, was simply to help. Within weeks, human engineers landed on the Turi homeworld. Not soldiers, not administrators, not governors, engineers. They brought construction machinery, medical supplies, and advanced agricultural tech, and they started helping the Turi rebuild their world. They fixed the infrastructure the Vithari had let crumble. They cleaned up the toxic pollution left behind by Vithari mining operations, and they introduced medical treatments for diseases that had plagued the Turi for centuries, because the Vithari had never considered their vassals worth the effort to heal. Teachers came too. Human educators started schools and training programs, not to teach the Turi how to be human, but to help them rediscover the knowledge and culture the Vithari had tried to erase. Turi art forms that had been outlawed were brought back with human funding. Turi languages that were on the verge of disappearing were documented and saved. Their history, which had been wiped clean, was pieced back together from whatever fragments remained. And the humans asked for nothing in return. Absolutely nothing. No resources, no political alliances, no military bases, no special trade deals. Not even a thank you. They just helped. Quietly, efficiently, and simply because it needed to be done, and they were the ones who could do it. The leader of the Turi delegation, an old female named Saraven, stood in a newly built hospital in her planet's capital city and just wept. She cried because the hospital was beautiful, because her people would no longer die from curable illnesses, and because the species that made it all happen was asking for nothing. She cried because in 400 years of being ruled, no one had ever just helped. And she cried because she was starting to understand something about humanity that the rest of the galaxy was still struggling to grasp. This same scene, with small changes, happened on all 19 of the former vassal worlds. Human aid workers, engineers, doctors, and teachers spread across the galaxy in what became the largest humanitarian effort in recorded history. They worked side by side with the locals, respecting their customs, learning their languages, and tailoring their aid to what was needed, instead of forcing human solutions onto alien problems. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were misunderstandings, cultural clashes, and mistakes were made. But the intention behind it was pure, and the results were undeniable. The galaxy watched, and it had no idea what to think. This wasn't how power was supposed to work. This wasn't how history went. When you won a war, you took things. You expanded your borders. You seized resources. You installed friendly governments. You built an empire. That was the way it was. That was the way it had always been. Every great civilization in galactic history had done it. The Vithari did it. The Kree did it. The Salari did it. As far as anyone was concerned, it was the natural order of things. Strength was meant to serve itself. Power was meant to be used. A victory was meant to be exploited. Humanity wasn't doing any of that. And this lack of exploitation was, in its own way, more unnerving than if they had just taken over. Because if the humans weren't driven by the desire for power, or land, or wealth, then what on earth did they want? What kind of species builds the most powerful military in the galaxy, and then uses it to free someone else's slaves? Dr. Lisseth Kale was the one who tried to answer that question. She published a book she'd been working on for years, a deep analysis she called The Deathworld Doctrine, Understanding Humanity's Philosophy of Quiet Strength. It became the most read academic text in the history of the Conquered, downloaded billions of times on thousands of worlds. Her main point was both elegant and terrifying. Humans, she argued, weren't peaceful in spite of being dangerous. They were peaceful because they were dangerous. Their relationship with violence wasn't one of inexperience or avoidance. It was a relationship of deep, personal, and painful familiarity. Violence was baked into every single layer of their existence. You have to understand, humans were practically designed for conflict. Evolution forged them to be strong, fast, and resilient. They have the forward-facing eyes of a predator and hands that can ball into fists. Their entire history is drenched in violence. Thousands of years of wars, atrocities, and bloodshed that they don't celebrate, but study as cautionary tales for their children. Their very psychology is a balancing act, a constant tug-of-war between their capacity for aggression and a deep-seated desire to rise above it. They know violence like a recovering addict knows their drug. They understand its power, its allure, and how dangerously easy it would be to give in. But as a civilization, after centuries of suffering and slow, painful lessons, they made a collective decision: never again. This quietness, as the scholar Lissith pointed out, wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a profound form of discipline, the most difficult kind. It was the discipline of a species that could have taken everything, but chose to take nothing. It was the self-control of a people who let the galaxy laugh at them for 300 years, who endured mockery and dismissal without ever once raising a hand in anger. They knew that a single act of rage was the first step down a path they had vowed never to walk again. They built their military not as a weapon of conquest, but as an absolute guarantee that they would never be backed into a corner and forced to become the monsters they once were. It was a shield, not a sword. They were the quiet ones, not because they had nothing to contribute, but because they had learned that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is to say nothing at all. This theory made Lissith famous. She hated the fame. For 40 years, she had tried to warn everyone, but nobody listened until it was too late. The recognition felt less like an achievement and more like a galaxy-wide apology, one that had been paid for with thousands of lives that never should have been lost. In the months following the war, the galactic political scene changed in ways no one could have imagined. Species that had been bitter rivals for centuries started talking. The simple, undeniable fact that the galaxy's strongest civilization was also its most restrained one forced everyone to rethink what power truly meant. The species they had liberated from the Dominion formed a new coalition, the Liberated Worlds Compact. They didn't swear allegiance to humanity. Humanity never asked them to. Instead, they promised each other mutual defense and support, an alliance forged in shared trauma and the shocking experience of being saved by a power that asked for nothing in return. It was the first interstellar alliance in history built not on strategy, but on pure gratitude and solidarity. Other species approached the humans, offering military pacts and trade deals more generous than any they had seen before. Humanity agreed to some trade, but politely turned down all military alliances, just as they always had. But the way they said no felt different now. Before, the galaxy assumed they refused because they were weak and had nothing to bring to the table. Now, everyone understood. They refused because they didn't need anything from anyone and didn't want to get tangled in the messy obligations of military pacts. Other species, however, grew paranoid. If humanity could hide 18,000 warships for 300 years, what else were they capable of? If their technology was a century ahead of everyone else's, how long until they used it for conquest? Just because they had shown restraint this time didn't mean they would forever. Power always corrupts. These were valid, reasonable fears, and the humans didn't try to brush them aside. When a concerned representative brought it up, Ambassador Alar Voss addressed it head-on. "You are right to be cautious," she said. "We would be too, if we were in your position. We can't prove our intentions with words, only with time. So watch us. Judge us by our actions, not by our promises. That's all we ask of you." It wasn't an answer that fully satisfied anyone, but it was honest. And honesty, the galaxy was slowly realizing, was the only currency humanity dealt in. There was one final meeting of consequence. It took place 3 months after the war, in a small private room on a neutral station, far from any cameras or diplomats. Corvistine, the former supreme warlord of the Vithari Dominion, had requested a personal audience with Ambassador Voss. He had been stripped of his title, but surprisingly, not imprisoned. As part of the surrender, the humans hadn't demanded his punishment. The Vithari people, shamed by their loss, had screamed for his head, but their new government found a sliver of courage and refused. Corvith was allowed to retire in disgrace, a fate worse than death for a Vithari warrior, but far better than what most defeated warlords could expect. Voss granted the meeting. Corvith came alone. He looked old, scarred, and broken. His bronze scales had lost their sheen, and he moved with a slowness that hadn't been there before the war. His cybernetic eye glitched, a casualty of the final battle that was never properly fixed. Ara was already there, sitting in a simple chair at a plain table. 2 glasses of water sat between them, nothing more. He took the seat across from her. For a long moment, silence filled the room. In a strange way, these two probably understood each other better than anyone else in the galaxy. He was the one who had unleashed the war. She was the one who had tried to stop it. They had been adversaries in the biggest conflict in a century, and both had watched it unfold with the unique agony of knowing exactly how it would end from the very beginning. "I have one question," Corvith finally said. His voice was a ragged, exhausted whisper. Ara just nodded. "Ask." He leaned forward, his one good eye fixing on her. "You could have annihilated us," he rasped. "You could have taken our worlds, scattered our people, and erased our entire civilization from history. You had the power, and by any law of war that has ever existed, you had the right. We attacked you. We tried to enslave you. By every code I have ever known, the loser submits to the winner's will. You could have made an example of us that would have kept the galaxy in fear for 1,000 years. He stared at her, his gaze a mixture of his natural eye and the broken, flickering prosthetic. Why didn't you? Ara was quiet for a moment, studying the old warrior. She saw something most wouldn't. Not a monster, but just a man. An old man who had lived his whole life believing strength was everything, only to discover that the strongest species in the universe played by a completely different set of rules he couldn't comprehend. "Because once," she said softly, "we were you." He frowned in confusion. "A very long time ago, on our home world, we were exactly like you. We were conquerors, empire builders, and destroyers. We fought endless wars. We enslaved one another. We burned cities to the ground, salted the fields of our enemies, and built monuments to our own glory on top of their bones. We got so good at destruction that we nearly wiped ourselves out more than once." She paused, letting the words sink in. "The last time, we came very, very close. Close enough to stare into the abyss of our own extinction, and it terrified us enough to finally change." Her eyes met his. "It took us centuries, centuries of learning the hard way, through blood and failure and immense suffering, that conquest never leads to peace. That domination doesn't provide security. And that strength without restraint is just a fancy term for suicide." She looked at Corvith, her gaze unwavering. "We didn't spare your people because we think we're better than you. We spared you because we remember what it's like to be the conqueror who realizes, far too late, that they've destroyed the very thing they were trying to build. True strength isn't about what you can destroy, Corvith. It's about what you choose to protect. Even when you're protecting an enemy who just tried to destroy you." Corvith sat perfectly still. The room felt silent enough to hear the stars turning outside. "I think," he said, his voice slow and different now. Softer, filled with a newfound uncertainty. It was the voice of a lifelong student facing a brand new lesson. "I think I would like to understand your people better." A warm, gentle smile spread across Ara's face. A smile that no longer seemed unsettling at all. Then you're already starting to, she replied. They sat together for a while longer, drinking their water and talking about small things. The kind of things former enemies talk about when they are trying to find their way back to being people again. Corvus asked about Earth, and Ara told him about its vast oceans, its towering mountains, and the colors of its sky at sunset. In return, Corvus described the volcanic glass caves on his home world, where shimmering crystals grew in colors that had no names. They were just two old souls, tired of war, finding a little common ground in the simple fact that their homes were beautiful. As Corvus got up to leave, he paused at the door. "My blade," he said. "The one I surrendered to you. The ceremonial blade of the Supreme Warlord." Ada reached into a case by her chair and pulled out the weapon. It was made of ancient, razor-sharp volcanic glass, blacker than the void between stars. She held it out to him, hilt first. "We never wanted it," she said simply. "It belongs to your people." He stared at the weapon, then took it with a tenderness reserved for something both treasured and agonizing. "Thank you," he said, and the gratitude went far beyond the blade itself. With that, the galaxy settled into an era historians would call the New Quiet. This wasn't like the Old Quiet, which was a choice humanity made to step back from the galactic game. No, the New Quiet was different. It was the hush that falls after a hurricane, when the air smells clean and the world feels brand new, even if it looks the same. Humanity returned to its 12 systems, and the trade ships resumed their routes. The diplomats took their seats at their councils. The censor curtains surrounding their territory remained, but now it felt less like a secret and more like a polite boundary. Everyone knew it was there. Everyone knew what lay behind it, and everyone knew that the species behind it could have taken everything, but chose not to. So when human envoys spoke softly in the halls of their former enemies, every species paid attention. Not just out of fear, though there was some of that, but because they'd learned that when the quiet ones finally speak, you listen. When a human starship passed through alien space, it was no longer met with scorn, but with a respectful nod. The captains of other ships would flash a simple greeting, the human ship would reply in kind, and they would both peacefully go on their way. It was a small interaction, but it carried a weight it never had before. When squabbles broke out between other species, as they always did and always would, a new question entered every strategic calculation. It wasn't, "What will the humans do?" but rather, "What would the humans think of this?" It was a subtle shift, an influence you couldn't chart or measure, but it was real. The knowledge that somewhere, on the galaxy's edge, a species was watching with quiet patience, a species that held the power to remake the universe, but also possessed the wisdom not to. The galaxy wasn't perfect. It never was, and never would be. Species still bickered. Empires still rose and fell. Injustice was still a fact of life. Humanity didn't solve every problem, because that was impossible. Trying to do so would have been the very arrogance they had spent so long unlearning. But things were a little better, a little kinder, a little more thoughtful. And that was enough. That was the whole point of 300 years of silence. It wasn't to hide or to bide their time, but to prove that the most powerful statement a species can make is choosing not to speak when you have every right to scream. And deep beneath the Earth's surface, in a facility that didn't exist on any map, a single red light on the machine named Prometheus dimmed back to standby. The crisis was over. Its calculations were done. The threat was handled with the absolute minimum force required. The humans were safe, and the galaxy was still intact. That's all that mattered. The vast intelligence returned to its version of sleep, waiting. Patient, silent, and ready. Just as it had always been and always would be. It was a guardian, built by a species that knew the meaning of guardianship better than anyone, because they knew the horror that comes when no one is standing watch. The stars continued their slow dance, The galaxy took a breath, and the quiet ones went back to being quiet, because they had learned a long, long time ago, in the blood and fire of their own beautiful, terrible world, the oldest and truest lesson there is. The most deafening sound in the universe comes from a silence that could have shattered the stars.